My name is Claire Reed. I am 52 years old. On the night of my father's 70th birthday party, a man I had never met walked through the front door of my parents' house in Richmond, Virginia, and said he had been looking for me for 17 years. He was not supposed to be there. Neither was the truth he was carrying. His son had brought him over without any warning, and the entire family was standing in the living room when it happened, including my sister, who had spent the better part of that evening explaining to her new boyfriend why my career in the Navy had come to an end the way it did. She had been telling that story for a long time now. She had polished it smooth over years of retelling until it sat neatly in her hands, manageable and small, the way people do with things they need to make sense of. My sister said I had fired myself, that I had been too stubborn to follow a simple order, that I had thrown away a good career because I could not set aside my pride for 5 minutes and trust the system that had trained me. She was wrong about almost all of it. And the man standing in my parents' doorway knew the whole story. His name was David Farley. He was 68 years old. I had last seen his name on a transfer authorization form in the spring of 2007, written above a set of vital signs that had made me set my clipboard down on the edge of the exam table and stare at the far wall for a long moment before I wrote a single word. I had not known his face then. I had been looking at his chart, at his electrocardiogram, at a number that had no business being as low as it was in a man who was supposed to climb into an FA-18 that afternoon. He walked into my parents' living room and found me across the crowd of aunts and cousins and birthday plates, the way you find a person when you have been thinking about their face for a long time without knowing quite what it looks like. My father was holding a piece of birthday cake he had not eaten. My sister had gone completely still. Marcus, who had made the call that brought his father here, was standing near the door with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor, as if he had done something he could not take back and was not yet sure whether it had been the right thing. David Farley said, "I have been looking for you for 17 years to say something. I want to say it while I still have the chance." I set down my coffee mug. I had been holding it the way I hold things when I am trying not to show that my hands feel uncertain, both palms wrapped around the ceramic, which is a habit my colleague Patricia has pointed out more than once. The kitchen was 10 feet behind me. My father's birthday candles had been blown out 2 hours earlier, and the house still smelled like warm wax and sugar. A smell that meant something safe and ordinary when I was 8 years old, and now meant something I could not quite put a name to. I said, "Mr. Farley?" He nodded. He said, "That's right." I had been carrying what happened on that Tuesday in 2007 for 17 years. And until that moment, standing in my parents' living room in Richmond, with my sister's face gone pale beside the bookshelf, I had believed that no one who needed to understand would ever understand. I want to go back to the beginning. Not to that Tuesday, though the Tuesday is what everything turns on. Not even to the Navy, though the Navy is where the shape of my life was cast in the form it took. I want to go back to the summer I was 16 years old, sitting in the waiting room of my mother's hospital on a folding chair, drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup, watching the nurses move through the hallway with a particular quality of purpose that I had not seen anywhere else in the world. They knew where they were going. They knew what they were doing when they got there. And more than that, they understood something about the people they were moving toward that the people themselves did not yet understand. There was a kind of authority in that which had nothing to do with rank or title or the approval of anyone in a room. It came from the knowledge itself, from the actual knowing. I decided that summer that I wanted to have that kind of knowing for the rest of my life. My mother is a retired nurse. My father spent 30 years as a civil engineer for the state of Virginia. They raised my sister Diane and me in a house in Richmond that smelled like good coffee and hardware store receipts, and the particular combination of order and warmth that comes from two people who genuinely believe in the work they do. They believed in institutions the way people of a certain generation believe in things that have worked long enough to seem permanent. You followed procedures. You respected authority. You trusted the systems that trained you. This was not cynicism or blind obedience. It was genuine faith in the idea that if everyone did their part correctly, the larger machine would function correctly. And if the larger machine functioned correctly, most people would be protected. I believed that for a while. I believed it through high school and through my undergraduate years at the University of Virginia on a scholarship that I took very seriously because I understood what it had cost my parents to support me in earning it. I believed it through the first 2 years of pre-medicine through the anatomy labs and the pharmacology lectures and the long study sessions in the library that started after dinner and ended when the cleaners came through at 2 in the morning. I signed a scholarship agreement with the Navy in my junior year that would pay for medical school in exchange for military service. I was 21 years old. I wanted to be a doctor. I also wanted to see something beyond Virginia, and the Navy offered both of those things in the same envelope, which seemed like an efficient arrangement for someone who had been efficient about most things her whole life. What I did not fully understand until I was already in it was that aviation medicine is one of the stranger intersections that human beings have managed to create. A flight surgeon is not a pilot, though flight surgeons are required to learn to fly, because you cannot understand the physiological experience of aviation from the outside. You have to know what it feels like to lose your horizon reference in a cloud bank. You have to know what happens to your inner ear when you roll inverted and hold it. You have to understand in your body what your patients describe, or you are not equipped to evaluate whether what they are describing is within normal parameters or a signal of something that needs attention. So I learned to fly, which I did adequately and without particular grace, and I learned everything the textbooks contained about what a human body endures in a high-performance cockpit. I did my medical degree at Uniformed Services University in Bethesda. I did my residency and my aerospace medicine training on top of that. By the time I received orders to Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach in the spring of 2002, I was 30 years old. I had been in medicine long enough to understand the distance between what the textbook says and what the patient in front of you is actually telling you, and I was happy in a way I had not expected and did not have the vocabulary to describe accurately. I was not someone who talked about happiness as a category. I was someone who showed up for things and did them well and moved on to the next thing. Happiness was not a destination I was navigating toward. But looking back at 2002, I can say that I was in the right place, doing the right work, and that is the closest thing to happiness I know how to recognize in my own history. The air station at Oceana was a different world from anything I had lived in before. There was a particular quality to the late afternoon light there. The way it came over the tree line at the edge of the base just as the jets were finishing their last cycles of the day, descending in a long, clean line off the Atlantic, and the sound they made would come through your chest wall before it reached your ears. A physical event more than an auditory one. I had a small office in the medical building that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. I had a corpsman named Petty Officer James, who was 23 years old, from Baton Rouge, and who had the particular competence of someone who had learned things from the bottom up and therefore understood exactly where each step connected to the next. He refilled my thermos without being asked. I noticed that about him on the second day and never stopped noticing it. I had a bad right knee. This is relevant, not for dramatic purposes, but because it was a fact of my daily life for the entire time I was in the Navy and has remained a fact of my daily life since. I fell on a wet flight deck during a training exercise in the North Atlantic in the winter of 2001, when a rogue wave caught the ship mid-maneuver, and I went down hard on the non-skid surface at a speed and angle that did the structural damage that knees do not fully recover from, regardless of how competent the surgical intervention is. The surgery had gone well. The physical therapy had gone well. What had not gone well was the part where the knee received all of this information and updated its behavior accordingly. In cold weather, it ached with a steady, low, insistent pressure that I had learned to work around the way you learn to work around a noise in the wall of a house that you cannot identify the source of but have determined is not structural. I wore a brace under my flight suit on bad days. I did not talk about it. I arrived 30 minutes early to everything, which meant I was usually already at my desk when the discomfort was at its worst, and no one saw it. I saw 47 pilots in the medical bay in my first month at Oceana. I remember the exact number because I was keeping close track, the way you do when a job is new and you are not yet sure you deserve it. Most of them had ordinary concerns, head colds they needed cleared before flight, annual physical requirements, the occasional back complaint from spending too many hours buckled into an ejection seat that was designed to save a pilot's life at the cost of the spine's long-term cooperation. A few of them had things they had been putting off addressing because addressing them meant being grounded, and being grounded meant not flying. And not flying was, for the men and women I worked with, a particular kind of deprivation that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the architecture of who they understood themselves to be. I understood that. I did not need to be a pilot to understand it. I had chosen a profession that defined me too. I knew what it felt like to have the work be the core of the thing, the load-bearing element that everything else in the structure depended on. And because I understood it, I also understood the pressure it created in the exam room. The pressure to say you are fine when you are not entirely certain. The pressure to trust that the symptom you have been ignoring is the kind that can be safely continued to ignore. The pressure to get through today because today is the day that matters and the symptom has been manageable so far. My job was to be the person in the room who was not subject to that pressure. That is the entire function of the flight surgeon in the chain of command. Not to be unkind, not to ground people unnecessarily, not to be the obstacle between a capable pilot and their aircraft, but to be the one authority in the building whose judgment about the human body was not filtered through operational need or squadron readiness or the very understandable desire of a pilot to keep flying. That was the job. That was what the job had always been designed to be. For 5 years at Oceana, I did that job without significant incident. I grounded people when they needed to be grounded. I cleared people when they were safe to fly. I wrote everything down with precision. I kept my records the way a person keeps records when they understand that records are the only durable thing in an environment where spoken conversations evaporate and institutional memory is selective. I drank too much coffee. I had the same argument with Petty Officer James about the proper temperature for storing vaccine supplies approximately 400 times over 5 years, and we were both right about different parts of it. I went home to my apartment in Virginia Beach on weeknights and made food I was only partially interested in and watched the news and went to bed. On weekends, I drove around the Tidewater area on no particular errand, which was the way I relaxed, which Patricia later identified as the behavior of someone who had spent too long in an environment where standing still felt like a liability. This was my life at Oceana for 5 years. It was a good life. I was useful in ways that were specific and concrete. I understood the limits of my authority, and I understood that above those limits sat the limits of my conscience. And for 5 years, I believed those two things would never be forced into conflict with each other. Then came a Tuesday morning in April of 2007. I had been at Oceana long enough by then to know the rhythm of the base, the way you know a building you have worked in for years, by the way the air moves through it, by the sounds that are normal and the sounds that are not. The morning of the 24th of April was a high-tempo day. There was a large joint exercise scheduled, multiple squadrons, the kind of operation that required precise coordination and full participation, and that generated, in the hours before it began, a particular quality of pressure that was not spoken aloud but was present in every room like a second weather system. Everyone knew what the day was. Everyone understood what was at stake operationally. The pressure was not malicious or inappropriate. It was simply the nature of the work. The weight that comes from knowing that what you do today has consequences for a lot of people and a lot of planning. Lieutenant Commander David Farley arrived in the medical bay at 700 hours for a routine pre-flight physical. He was 41 years old. He was one of the most experienced FA-18 pilots on the base. He had flown combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. He had thousands of flight hours logged in conditions that ranged from routine to genuinely dangerous, and he had always come back and always performed and always been the kind of pilot that command could depend on to anchor an operation like the one scheduled for that morning. Everyone on the base knew his reputation. I knew his reputation. He was not a man anyone was expecting to have a problem with on a Tuesday in April. He sat down across from me and answered the standard intake questions the way pilots answer them when they are used to being cleared and have not been given any reason to expect today to be different. Blood pressure, visual acuity, the respiratory questions, the sleep questions, the medication review. He answered everything calmly and accurately. Nothing in his manner suggested anything other than a man going through a procedure he had gone through hundreds of times before. I put my stethoscope on his chest. I listened. I moved the stethoscope and listened again. I said, "Hold on a moment," and kept my expression neutral, which is a thing you learn to do in medicine because the patient's face is watching your face and your face is the first piece of information they receive. He did not look alarmed. He looked mildly curious, the way experienced pilots look when a process deviates from the expected, which is to say they look interested rather than concerned, because deviations are data, and data is information, and information is something pilots are trained to use rather than fear. I ran an electrocardiogram. I sat with the result for a long moment. His heart rate was in the low 40s. This alone was not necessarily alarming. Highly conditioned athletes can run resting rates that low. But the rhythm was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not in a way that would produce symptoms walking around a base on a Tuesday morning, but wrong in a specific way that had a specific name and a specific set of implications in the context of a man about to climb into a high-performance aircraft. The finding was consistent with a third-degree atrioventricular block. A third-degree AV block is a failure of the electrical conduction system between the upper and lower chambers of the heart. In everyday life, the heart compensates. A person can carry this condition for years without knowing they have it, especially if the compensatory rate is adequate and the demands on the cardiovascular system are ordinary. But flight operations are not ordinary demands. The G-forces generated by an F/A-18 in combat maneuvering accelerate blood away from the brain at a rate the cardiovascular system must actively fight against to maintain consciousness. A heart with a compromised electrical conduction system, placed under that kind of physiological load, is at elevated risk of sudden, complete arrhythmia, which means sudden loss of consciousness, which means, in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, coming down without choosing to. I looked at the electrocardiogram for a long time. I looked at his face, which was calm and unhurried and entirely certain that this was going to be a normal morning and then a flight and then another Thursday before the weekend. I looked at the flight schedule on the board behind my desk. I looked at the number on the readout again. I said, "Lieutenant Commander Farley, I'm going to need to hold your clearance today." The room temperature changed. Not dramatically. It was the same kind of change that happens when you say something in a quiet room that redirects everything. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I have a finding I need to have evaluated before I can clear you for flight. I want you to go to Portsmouth today for a cardiology consult." He said, "There's an exercise this morning." I said, "I understand that." He said, "What kind of finding?" I said, "A cardiac rhythm issue I want ruled out before you go up. It may be nothing. The cardiologist will determine that." He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who is trying to accurately assess the situation without wasting time on inaccurate assumptions. He was not angry. He was recalibrating. He said, "And if I go to Portsmouth, I'm out of the exercise." I said, "Yes." He said, "You're sure about this?" I said, "I am." He stood up. He said, "Then I'll go to Portsmouth." That was all he said. He walked out of the medical bay without argument or protest, which told me something about his character that I filed away and did not forget. My phone rang 11 minutes later. It was Commander Walsh from Operations. He said, "Dr. Reed, I understand there's a hold on Farley." I said, "That's correct." He said, "You understand the operational picture this morning." I said, "I understand it." He said, "Can you tell me what the finding is?" I said, "I'm referring him for further evaluation. My medical assessment stands." He said, "A referral means you're not certain." I said, "A referral means I have a finding that requires specialist evaluation before I can make a clearance determination. That is the appropriate response to this finding." He said, he's been flying for 17 years without an incident. He's the most experienced pilot on the line today. I said, "I understand his record." He said, "What are the chances the cardiology consult comes back clean?" I said, "I'm not able to speculate on that, Commander. My finding is documented. My recommendation is documented." There was a pause that lasted long enough that I could hear the sounds of the operations building on his end of the line. He said, "Dr. Reed, I am asking you to reconsider." I said, "I've noted your concern in the record." He said, "That is not what I asked." I said, "I know. My assessment is unchanged." He said, "I want you to know that this conversation is not finished." He was right about that part. What happened next, I learned in pieces over the following 24 hours. David Farley arrived at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center at 9:15 that morning. The cardiology team evaluated him through the morning and into the early afternoon. By midday, they had confirmed third-degree heart block. By 7 o'clock that evening, he was in the intensive care unit. By 11 that night, he had undergone emergency pacemaker implantation. I learned about the ICU the following morning. I also learned that same morning that an inquiry had been opened into my conduct. The language of the initial inquiry was careful and institutional and very precise. The phrase used was exceeded medical authority in a way that impacted operational readiness without adequate command consultation. What that phrase meant, translated into plain language, was that I had made a unilateral medical decision on a high-tempo exercise day, that the decision had removed a key asset from an important operation, and that I had done this without adequately consulting the operational command structure before making the call. I read that language 3 times, sitting at my desk with my coffee going cold. I looked at the phrase, exceeded medical authority. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about what medical authority meant. I thought about where it was supposed to come from. I thought about the electrocardiogram sitting in a file folder to my left, which documented a finding that had been confirmed by the cardiology team at a naval hospital and that had resulted in emergency cardiac surgery within 16 hours of my grounding decision. I thought about the word exceeded. I set the paper down. I picked up my coffee. I went back to work. Commander Walsh brought the formal paperwork to my office personally 2 weeks later. He set it on my desk with the particular care of someone who does not entirely endorse what they are delivering but has made peace with the fact that it is not their call. He said, "You should know that an operational review board will be convening to examine your decision-making process." I said, "Are they examining what the cardiology team found?" He said, "The clinical outcome is not what's under review." I said, "A pilot is alive today who would not have been if I had cleared him." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I understand that. I also understand that you made a call that disrupted an exercise affecting multiple squadrons and the readiness of this installation." I said, "That's what the job is." He said, "It's part of the job. The other part is understanding the chain of command and the appropriate channels for decisions that affect operations." I said, "The appropriate channel for a medical determination about a pilot's fitness for flight is the flight surgeon. That is why the position exists." He picked up his copy of the paperwork. He said, "The review board will be in touch." I said, "I'm sure they will." He left. Petty Officer James came in 10 minutes later with a refilled thermos and set it on my desk without saying anything, which was his way of saying everything he was not going to say aloud, and I was grateful for it. The review process took 4 months. During those 4 months, I continued to work in the medical bay exactly as I always had. I grounded pilots when they needed grounding. I cleared them when they were safe to fly. I came in 30 minutes early to everything. I wrote meticulous records for every patient encounter and every decision I made, with the particular thoroughness of someone who understands they are being watched and has decided to behave exactly the same whether or not they are being watched. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into the review, Petty Officer James came in with a thermos refill and set it down and said, "I've been thinking about something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "You ever notice that the people who get called in front of review boards are almost always the ones who did the job right?" I said, "I've noticed that." He said, "You think that means anything?" I said, "I think it means the system is better at protecting itself than it is at protecting the people inside it." He thought about that for a moment. He said, "That seems like a problem." I said, "Yes, it does." He went back to work. He was 28 years old, and he already understood things about institutions that some people spend entire careers trying to learn. He was the best corpsman I ever worked with, and I have worked with a great many of them. The review board issued its finding 4 months after the incident. I was recommended for administrative reassignment. What that meant, translated out of institutional language, was that I was being removed from the professional development track that led to command positions in naval medicine. I would not be selected for the senior leadership programs. I would not be considered for the billets that led to squadron commander or medical department head at the senior level. I would continue to practice medicine in the Navy, and my file would reflect a finding of procedural irregularity in my conduct, and the ceiling above my career had been permanently and significantly lowered. A one-star admiral I had met once at a conference read this finding to me in a small conference room in a building I had never been in before and would not return to. He read it in full. He asked if I understood. I said I understood. He asked if I had questions. I said I did not. He said I could appeal the finding through the appropriate administrative channels and that I had 60 days to initiate that process. I said I understood. I drove back to Virginia Beach and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I had a view of the neighbor's magnolia tree from the window. It was October, the same week of October my father's birthday fell, and the tree had turned yellow in the way Virginia trees turn in fall. Not dramatically, but completely, as if yellow was what it had always been planning on. I sat there until the light went, and the tree was just a shape. And then I made myself something to eat that I didn't finish. And then I went to bed. I did not appeal the finding. Not because I thought the finding was correct. I did not believe for 1 second that it was correct. I did not appeal it because I had spent the preceding 4 months looking carefully at the process, at the people in it, at the institutional logic that had produced it, and I understood that the process had not been designed to find a different answer. It had been designed to protect the operational structure from the precedent of a flight surgeon making unilateral clearance decisions on high-tempo days without command consultation. The appeal would have been heard by people whose institutional interests aligned with the finding. It would have taken another year. It would have produced the same result with more paperwork and more of my life spent inside the machinery of it. What I did instead was continue to do the job exactly the way I had done it before. I grounded pilots when they needed to be grounded. I cleared them when they were safe to fly. I wrote thorough records. I arrived early. I drank too much coffee. I did not ask permission from operational command for medical determinations because medical determinations were not things that required operational permission. I understood that I was a person, the institution was watching. I behaved exactly as I had always behaved because that was the only way I knew how to practice medicine. And because I had made a decision a long time ago about what kind of doctor I was going to be, and I was not going to revise that decision because someone had found the decision inconvenient. What I did not know, and would not know for 17 years, was what had become of David Farley. He had recovered well from the procedure. The pacemaker had resolved the arrhythmia, and his cardiac function had returned to normal. But a heart with an implanted pacemaker does not meet the physical standards required for high-performance military aviation. And so his flying career in the Navy had ended in the same month as the incident that saved his life. He was transferred within weeks of his recovery. He retired from the Navy before the year was out. He had been medically separated from the profession he had built his entire adult life around, and I had not known any of this. Because the Navy does not route patient outcome updates to the physicians who make grounding decisions and then face procedural review for making them. I knew his name only from the paperwork. I had never seen his face. I did not know if he was alive or dead. I had carried the knowledge of that Tuesday morning for 17 years, knowing the clinical outcome up to the point of surgical intervention and nothing beyond that, carrying a story that had no ending I could see from where I stood. I stayed at Oceana for 2 more years after the review board. Then I received orders to a staff physician position at Naval Hospital Jacksonville in Florida. The orders were clearly a sideways move in a career that was no longer moving forward, and I accepted them without protest, because protest would not have changed the orders, and I had learned by then to spend my energy on things that could be changed. I served in Jacksonville for 3 years. The work was honest work. I saw patients who needed medicine, and I gave them medicine, and the work was the same as it had always been in that respect. The daily concrete usefulness of knowing what was wrong with the person and knowing what to do about it. My knee continued to give me trouble. It always did in cold weather, and northern Florida has more cold weather than people expect. I developed a slight hitch in my gait on cold mornings that I worked to minimize and mostly managed. I took more ibuprofen than I should have. I went home to apartments that were temporary in the way of places you live in for 3 years knowing you will leave, that never quite accumulate the texture of permanence. By 2012, I had decided to separate from the Navy, not because I was asked to leave. I was not asked. I was doing the job, and the Navy would have continued to use me. But I had been doing a specific calculation for 2 years, the kind of arithmetic you do when you are trying to be honest with yourself about what is possible and what is not. The career I had spent my 20s and 30s building was no longer available to me. The positions I had been working toward, the kind of role where a flight surgeon's judgment shaped policy and training and the standards that protected pilots at scale, those were no longer options. What was available was a long, flat road in the middle distance that eventually ended somewhere without distinction. I had given 17 years to work I loved. I could give what remained of my career to work I still loved in a different container. I separated in March of 2012 and drove back to Virginia with everything I owned in my truck, which was an 11-year-old pickup I had been keeping running by force of will and selective maintenance, and which my sister had been asking me to replace for 3 years. I did not replace it for another 4 years, which was partly a financial calculation and partly the particular stubbornness of a person who does not like being told what to do about her own truck. I found a small town 20 miles south of Richmond that needed a family practice doctor, and I opened a clinic with a physician named Patricia, who had spent 15 years in emergency medicine and had her own reasons for having ended up somewhere other than where she had originally planned. We took a lease on a converted house with a waiting room that smelled like old carpet and possibility. We saw ordinary patients with ordinary problems. We dealt with insurance companies with the weary professionalism of people who have accepted that this is part of the work and are going to do it without complaining about it more than twice a week. We argued about the coffee situation in the break room on a near daily basis, which I consistently lost, because Patricia believed in a medium roast at a modest temperature, and I believed in something strong enough to qualify as a structural material. We knew our patients by name and their children's names, and in some cases their dogs' names. We knew who was going through a divorce and who was managing a parent's decline and who was avoiding a conversation with their doctor because they did not want to hear what they feared the conversation would confirm. We did the work that needed doing. It was a different life from the one I had planned at 21. It was a good life. I had decided to believe that about it completely, and most days I succeeded. I did not talk much about the Navy. When patients asked, I said I was a former military physician. When they asked what that had been like, I said it was important and demanding work. When they asked why I left, I said it was time for something different. These answers were true. They were not complete. But the complete version required explaining things about military medicine and institutional culture and the specific mechanics of how a person can do everything right and still end up punished for it, and that explanation tended to make people uncomfortable in ways that were not useful to anyone. My sister Diane had left the Navy 2 years before I did. She had been a naval aviator, a good one, and when she separated, she moved directly into a position with a commercial airline that valued her military credentials exactly as much as they deserved to be valued. She built a career that answered every question my family knew how to ask about success. She flew transatlantic routes. She bought a house in Charlotte with a good school district for reasons that turned out to be hypothetical, but the school district was good. She had a clear, ascending, publicly legible trajectory that my mother could describe at church and at dinner parties and at the grocery store without needing to explain anything complicated. I did not begrudge it. I want to be clear about that. Diane had worked hard and made good decisions and earned what she had. I was genuinely glad for her. What I could not quite manage was the corollary that seemed to exist in my family's arithmetic. The unspoken calculation in which her success existed in partial ratio to my failure, as if the careers of 2 daughters added up to some fixed quantity and the distribution had simply tilted more heavily in one direction. My mother asked me once, with the careful precision of a woman who had spent decades saying difficult things gently, whether I was happy. I said I was. She looked at me for a moment with the clinical assessment of a former nurse and said she just wanted me to know there were other practices, larger practices and better locations that might have been more appropriate for someone with my background. I said I knew that. She said she wasn't sure I'd applied myself fully to finding them. I said I had made the choices that made sense to me. She said she supposed so. We did not discuss it further. That was the language of my family regarding my career. Not unkind, not intended to wound, simply operating from a version of events that was incomplete because I had not provided the complete version. Partly because the complete version required a level of institutional literacy that was difficult to convey to people who had not lived in that world, and partly because telling the true story meant telling someone that I had done the right thing and been punished for it, and that kind of story makes people look for the place where you went wrong. They need there to be a lesson. They need the outcome to have been preventable, because if there is no preventable lesson, if you did everything correctly and the system still turned on you, that is a kind of information about the world that is very uncomfortable to hold. Diane had constructed her own version of events over the years, as people do when they are given incomplete information and need to fill the gap with something that makes sense. In her version, I was a talented doctor who had let my stubbornness override my judgment at a critical moment. I had made a unilateral call without adequate consultation. I had trusted my own assessment over the assessment of experienced commanders. I had been brilliant and difficult in equal measure, and the difficult part had eventually produced the outcome it was going to produce. It was a generous version in its own way. It gave me agency. It made me a tragic figure rather than a failed one, which requires a certain sympathy to construct. She had been telling that story for 17 years. I knew she believed it by then. I had watched her believe it across enough Thanksgiving dinners and birthday gatherings that the shape of it was familiar to me now, the way old furniture is familiar, present, and taken for granted. I drove to Richmond on a Saturday in October for my father's 70th birthday. I left my house 40 minutes before I needed to, which meant I arrived in my parents' driveway 35 minutes before anyone else was expected. This is what I always do. My father says I was born ready, which is his kind version of the same observation Patricia makes about my relationship with time, which is that I appear to treat punctuality as a form of defense. I sat in my truck in the driveway eating a gas station granola bar I had forgotten to throw away and watching the maple tree in the front yard, which had gone fully red in the way Virginia maples go in mid-October. That deep, true red that looks like the tree has been working toward it all summer, which I suppose it has. My knee ached. It always did in October. October in Virginia is cold enough to remind my knee of itself. I went inside and helped my mother arrange the table and set out napkins and confirm the ice situation. My father came downstairs in a blue shirt he had ironed badly and said he did not understand why we needed to make a fuss over 70. I said it was better than 69. He said that was the most medical observation he'd heard in years. I said I was glad to be of service. People came through the afternoon. My mother's sister and her husband, 3 cousins, 2 neighbors whose names I remembered from childhood, a couple from my parents' church who had been friends of the family longer than I had been alive. Their neighbor Connie arrived at 4 o'clock. Connie was 68 years old and had known my parents for 30 years and had the particular gift of some people that age of knowing exactly which things were worth saying and which were better left to the ambient understanding of the room. She found me in the kitchen within 10 minutes of arriving and asked about the clinic, and then, with the directness that I had always appreciated in her, asked about my knee. I said it was fine. She said, "It is not fine. You've been walking differently since you came in." I said, "It's October." She said, "Get a better brace. The one you're using is from 2 years ago." I said I would look into it. She gave me the look she always gave me when I said I would look into something, which accurately communicated that she did not believe me but was choosing to proceed as if she did. Diane arrived at 5:30 with a man I had not met. His name was David Farley. He was tall, early 30s, with the posture of someone whose professional life had spent years reminding him to sit up straight and who had listened. He was a pilot for a regional carrier. He was polite and interested and easy to be in a room with, which are rarer qualities together than separately. He shook my hand and asked what kind of medicine I practiced and listened to the answer with genuine attention, which I noticed because people do not always listen to the answer. We sat down to dinner at 6. My mother had made too much food in the way she always made too much food on occasions that mattered to her, which was her specific form of love and her way of saying that the people at this table were worth the extra work. The conversation moved around the table comfortably. My father's friend from church asked about Diane's routes. My cousin asked Marcus how long he had been flying. My mother brought up the price of airline tickets, which she did not approve of, as a general matter of principle. Then Diane said, Claire was in aviation for a while too. She was a flight surgeon. There was the small social shift that happens when a topic changes and people adjust. My father said, Claire was very good at it. Diane smiled with the particular smile she smiled when she was about to add something she had decided was necessary context. She said, she was, before she fired herself. The phrase settled over the table. I heard it the way I always heard it, not with anger anymore, or not much, with a kind of tired familiarity, the way you hear a song that has been played so many times that it no longer means what it once meant. It has just become a fact of the acoustic environment. I kept eating. Connie, who was sitting to my left, moved her fork in a way that told me she had heard it and filed it. My father said, well, Claire made some choices that were difficult. I said, it was a different time. That is the sentence I have used for 17 years to close that particular door. It says nothing and means nothing and ends the conversation. which is exactly what I needed to do. Diane said something about how the culture in the Navy had shifted since her era. The conversation moved elsewhere. I drank my coffee. The birthday cake was carried out. My father blew out the candles in the way he did everything, with the minimal necessary effort and a smile that was genuine. After dinner, when people had dispersed into the living room and the kitchen, and my father was at the dining room table with a small pile of cards and gifts, Marcus came and stood near me by the bookshelves. We had been talking intermittently throughout the evening in the natural way of people who have been placed in proximity and found they had things to say to each other. He asked about the clinic. He asked about the particular challenges of running a small practice. He asked good questions and listened to the answers. Then he said, "When you were a flight surgeon, were you stationed in Virginia?" I said, "Yes, Oceana, 2002 through 2009. He was quiet for a moment. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. A quality of stillness descended over it. The kind of stillness that comes over a person when something they have been carrying for a long time suddenly becomes relevant to the room they are standing in. He said, "I have to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that I'm not asking to cause any difficulty." I said, "All right." He said, "Did you ever ground a pilot named Farley at Oceana?" The sounds of the party continued around us. My cousin was laughing at something near the fireplace. My father was reading a birthday card aloud in the way he read things, fully and without abbreviation, which often made people impatient and which I had always found endearing. I said, "I don't discuss specific cases." He said, "I understand that. I'm not asking you to discuss the case. I'm asking if the name means anything to you." I said nothing. He said, 2007, April. His name was David Farley. He's my father. I set down my coffee cup. He said, quietly, he tells this story every year on his birthday. The same story, every year. A doctor at Oceana grounded him the morning of a big exercise, and the command came down hard on her for it. He never knew her name. He looked for it. He filed requests with the Navy. He called people he knew who were still in service. He asked doctors. Nobody would give him a name. He spent years trying to find out, and he never could. I said, "He's alive." It came out differently than I intended. Less a question and more a confirmation of something I had carried the theory of for 17 years without the concrete knowledge. I had known the surgical outcome. I had not known what came after. I had not known what kind of life had followed the pacemaker implantation, or whether the life had been long, or whether the man I had grounded on a Tuesday morning was still somewhere in the world living it. Marcus said, "He's alive and healthy. He's 68 years old. He plays too much golf and drives my mother completely crazy, and he has been telling this story at every birthday of his since it happened." I stood there for a moment without speaking. He said, "I want to call him. I want to ask if he wants to come over." I said, "Marcus, this is my father's birthday party." He said, "I know. I'm sorry. I know this is not what tonight was supposed to be. But he lives 20 minutes from here. And if you're who I think you are, then he has been looking for this conversation for 17 years. And I don't know when I'm going to be in the same room as you again." I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the party, my father at the table with his birthday cards, my mother coming out of the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder, Connie, who had materialized at a comfortable distance with the radar of someone who understood that something was happening and had positioned herself appropriately. I said, "Okay." He stepped outside. Connie appeared at my elbow with the precision she had always had and said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" I said, "I think so. Something is about to happen." She said, "What kind of something?" I said, "The kind I didn't know I was waiting for." She looked at me for a moment and said, "Okay." And then she stayed where she was, which was exactly what I needed her to do. Connie had always understood the difference between support that helps and support that smothers, which is a distinction a lot of people never figure out. Marcus came back inside 12 minutes later. He crossed the room toward me, and I watched his face. He said, "I called him, and he was already in the car," before I finished the sentence. He said to tell you he'll be there in 20 minutes. I looked around the room again. The evening my father had expected. The comfortable birthday gathering, the cake and the cards and the cousins and the people from church. I thought about the Tuesday in 2007 and the electrocardiogram and the number that had been wrong and the phone call from Commander Walsh and the 4 months of review and the finding and the transfer to Jacksonville and the flat road stretching forward from there. I thought about my sister's smile when she said before she fired herself. I thought about my mother's careful suggestion that I might not have tried hard enough to find something better. I said, okay, he can come. 22 minutes later, the doorbell rang. My father went to answer it because it was his house, and he was the kind of man who believed in answering his own front door, who thought that the gesture of going to a door personally said something about how you felt about whoever was standing on the other side of it. He opened it, and there was a man on the porch he did not know, a man with gray hair and a bearing that military service puts in a body and that retirement does not fully remove, and behind him a woman who was clearly his wife, and who had the expression of someone who had driven across the city on a Saturday night because her husband had needed her to. And she was the kind of person who showed up when someone she loved needed showing up for. My father said, "Can I help you?" The man said, "I'm looking for a doctor named Reed, Claire Reed. My son told me she was here." My father turned and looked across the room at me, and everyone in the room with any awareness turned too. And the quality of the air changed, the way it changes in rooms when something uncertain and large enters them. I said, "Mr. Farley." He crossed the room. He moved, like someone who had once been very fit and had kept most of it, upright and contained and deliberate, the way former military people move when they are carrying something important and have decided to carry it carefully. He looked at me with an expression that had many things in it. There was something that had been a long time without resolution. There was recognition of a face that had been imagined without being known. There was the particular weight of a person who has been preparing something to say for 17 years and is now in the room where the saying is possible. He said, "I have been looking for you for 17 years to say something. I want to say it while I still have the chance." Diane had gone completely still beside the fireplace. My father was standing by the front door with his hand still on the frame. Connie had not moved from her position beside me. I said, "Mr. Farley, you didn't need to come." He said, "Yes, I did." He said, "In April of 2007, a doctor at Naval Air Station Oceana grounded me on the morning of a major exercise. She did this against significant pressure from operations. She documented her finding, and she held her position, and she sent me to Portsmouth for a cardiac consult. That morning, I had a third-degree heart block and a heart that was about to spend several hours under high G loads. The cardiology team at Portsmouth put a pacemaker in me that night. The attending later told me that the probability of a fatal arrhythmia during flight operations that morning had been very high." He paused. His wife put a hand on his arm. He said, "After I recovered and after I was medically separated, I tried to find out who the flight surgeon was. The Navy does not release that kind of information easily, and the people I asked either didn't know or wouldn't say. I filed Freedom of Information requests. I made calls to doctors I knew who were still active. I talked to people who had been at Oceana around that time. Nobody gave me a name. I was told the doctor involved had been reassigned. I was told that an administrative action had been taken in connection with the decision. I was not told anything else." He said, "I have told this story every year on my birthday for 17 years. I have told it to my wife and my son and to anyone who would listen, because I believed that somewhere there was a person who needed to hear that what she did mattered, that I knew what it cost her, that I did not take it for granted." He said, "My son called me 20 minutes ago and gave me a name." The living room was absolutely quiet. The party sounds that had been the texture of the evening were gone. My mother had come out of the kitchen and was standing beside my father. The people from church, my cousin, everyone in the room was still and present and watching. He said, "I know you were punished for what you did. I know the decision was used against you. I know that the system responded the way systems sometimes respond to the right call made at the wrong time, which is to protect itself rather than acknowledge the person who made it. I know you did not get a thank you. I know that for 17 years, the outcome of that morning has been the thing that was used to define your career rather than the thing you did that morning, which was see something that no one else in that building was looking for and act on it." He said, "I am standing in your father's house on my way home from a Saturday evening, and I'm 68 years old, and my heart has been working correctly for 17 years because of what you did, and I want you to know that I know. I know what it was. I know what it cost. And I am sorry it took me this long to be standing in front of you saying it. The room stayed quiet for a long time after he stopped speaking. My father was still in the doorway. His 70th birthday had turned into something none of us had planned, which was, in some ways, the best birthday gift I had given him accidentally, because my father believed in things coming, right? If you were patient enough and kept doing the work. And tonight, in his own living room, he was watching something come right. My sister was standing near the fireplace with her mouth open slightly, the first time in my adult life I had seen her genuinely, without words. She was looking at David Farley and then looking at me and then looking at Marcus, and something was moving across her face that I recognized as the expression of someone whose version of a story has just been replaced by the real one. I said, "Thank you, Mr. Farley." He said, "David." I said, "David." He said, "I want to say one more thing. I want to say that the people who write the manuals and the operational guidelines and the authority structures that determine what a flight surgeon can and cannot do unilaterally, those people assumed a certain set of conditions when they wrote those rules. They assumed that the chain of command would always be available for consultation. They assumed that the information required for a medical decision could be shared without compromising the decision. They assumed, maybe, that the command authority would weigh the medical concern appropriately when it was raised. They wrote the rules for a world where the system would work if everyone used it correctly. He said, on the morning of April 24th of 2007, the system was not going to work correctly. The exercise was too important and the pressure was too high, and I was too experienced and too valued for the system to weigh the concern correctly. You knew that. You knew it from the moment you looked at the electrocardiogram and picked up the phone to call operations and heard the voice on the other end. He said, "So you held the line, and you held it alone. And the system punished you for it, the way systems punish people who hold the line alone. And I have been alive for 17 more years." His wife, whose name I learned was Susan, who had been a trauma nurse for 20 years before she retired and who had therefore spent her career also holding lines that needed holding, was looking at me with an expression of recognition and warmth that I did not have words for. I said, "I'm glad you're here." He said, "So am I." My father said, from the doorway, "Please come in. There is birthday cake that should not go to waste." David Farley came in. Susan came in. Marcus went back to where Diane was standing, and I watched my sister watch him come toward her, and I watched something move across her face that was not entirely comfortable for her and that she was going to need time with. I understood that. The story she had been telling for 17 years had been replaced in the last 10 minutes by a different story. And the new story said something about the old one that was difficult to sit with. I was not looking for her acknowledgement. I had not arranged this evening. It had arrived on its own, the way things sometimes arrive. Connie appeared beside me with a small plate. She said, "You should eat something." I said, "Probably." She said, "David Farley drove here on 20 minutes notice on a Saturday night to say what he had to say. The least you can do is eat some cake." I did, slightly. Something shifted in my chest when I did. Something small and physical. A kind of release. Not dramatic, nothing like what people describe in stories, but real. Like a door that had been sealed shut for 17 years had opened just a crack, and what came through was ordinary cool air. My father had found David Farley and was settling into the chair beside him near the bookshelf. And two old military men were talking to each other in the way they talk when they are both honest about the cost, with a particular frankness that requires no performance because the audience has already been established. Susan was in the kitchen with my mother. My cousin had refilled his glass and was sitting back down. The party had resumed and was also something completely different from what it had been before. At some point, Diane came to stand beside me. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." She said, I didn't know any of it. Not the finding, not the review board, not what it actually cost you." I said, "You had a version that made sense to you." She said, "That's not the same thing as the truth." I said, "No, it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why didn't you tell me what actually happened?" I said, "I didn't know how to tell it in a way that would make sense without background you didn't have." and I didn't want to be the person who needed to explain herself. I was tired of explaining. She said, I called you stubborn at dinner tables for years. I said, I heard. She said, I'm sorry. I looked at her. My sister was 47 years old and she had built a good life and she was not a cruel person and she had operated for 17 years on incomplete information and had done what people do with incomplete information, which is fill the gap with something that makes the shape of it make sense. I was not angry with her. I had not been angry with her for a long time. What I had been was invisible to her, and it had cost something. And now it didn't cost that anymore. I said, I know you are. She said, you've been carrying this alone for 17 years. I said, not entirely alone. My patients knew I was their doctor. That was enough on most days. She made a sound that might have been the start of something and stopped it. She looked at David Farley, sitting in the chair by the bookshelf, talking with my father and gesturing with his hands in the way of someone telling a story they know well and have been wanting to tell in the right room for a long time. She said, I'm going to need some time to understand this. I said, take whatever you need. We stood together for a moment and then she went to find Marcus, and I stood with my coffee cup and watched my father's birthday party be the thing it had become. I drove home that night with the windows down a little, which is a thing I do in October when the air has an edge to it, but not yet a cold one, when it is interesting rather than uncomfortable. My knee ached the way my knee always aches in October. The radio was on, and I was not particularly listening to it. I drove through Richmond in the dark, through the neighborhoods I knew from childhood, past the streets with the trees that went red and yellow every fall, past the churches and the gas stations and the residential blocks that had been there my whole life. I thought about a Tuesday morning in 2007 in a small exam room at Naval Air Station Oceana. I thought about the electrocardiogram and the number that was wrong. I thought about Commander Walsh on the phone and the particular quality of institutional pressure in his voice. I thought about the administrative reassignment finding and the one-star admiral reading it aloud in a room I never went back to. I thought about Jacksonville and the long flat road. I thought about the clinic and Patricia and the patients whose names I knew and the ordinary daily work of being the last person standing between a human being and something that was going to hurt them. I had carried that Tuesday for 17 years, not guilt because I had never been guilty, not regret because I would make the same decision every time, and I knew that about myself clearly enough not to waste time questioning it. What I had carried was the weight of a story that had been told wrong in my own family and told wrong in my own file and told wrong in the institutional record that had shaped what was possible for me. The weight of doing the right thing and having the right thing be used as evidence against you. The weight of invisibility in a story that was yours. And then a man drove across the city on a Saturday night because his son called him, and he stood in a living room in Richmond, Virginia, and said that he knew. He knew it had been the right call. He knew the cost. He knew that no one had said thank you. He had spent 17 years trying to find the person he wanted to thank, and tonight he had found her in his son's girlfriend's family's living room at a birthday party, which is the kind of thing that happens in the world sometimes, the kind of convergence you cannot plan and cannot manufacture, and that arrives on its own schedule from directions you were not watching. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my truck for a few minutes. The porch light was on because I always leave it on, which Patricia says is the behavior of someone waiting for company they haven't invited yet. I sat in the dark with the windows down and the October air moving through and the red maple at the edge of my yard visible in the porch light, going about its annual transformation at its own pace and on its own terms. In the morning, I went to the clinic early, which is what I do. I made coffee, which Patricia arrived at 8 to complain about on the grounds of excessive strength. I sat at my desk with the morning schedule in front of me. Patricia came in, poured herself coffee, made the face she always made, and looked at me for a moment. She said, "You look different." I said, "I do." She said, "Good, different, or concerning different?" I said, "Good." She said, "What happened?" I said, "Someone said something to me I had needed to hear for a while." She considered that. She set her coffee down on the edge of my desk and said, "Good." Then she picked it up and went to check the morning charts, because that was what needed doing next, and Patricia understood that the next thing that needed doing was usually the right response to most situations. The patients came in, the charts were there, the work was the same work it had always been. the ordinary and essential work of being the person in the room who knows what they are looking at and is willing to say so and is willing to hold the line when holding it is what the situation requires. A pilot's heart, a child's fever, an old man's blood pressure that had not been where it should be for 2 years. The daily, particular, and important work of medicine. I had always been willing to do it. I would always be willing to do it. What I knew on the morning after my father's 70th birthday that I had not known the morning before was that somewhere in the world the decisions you make in the hardest moments are being remembered, not by the institutions that required you to make them, not by the people who punished you for making them, by the person you made them for, by the man who drove across the city in 20 minutes on a Saturday night because he had been waiting for 17 years to stand in front of you and say the thing that needed saying. He had lived for 17 more years. He played too much golf. He drove his wife perfectly and happily crazy. He had raised a son who paid attention to his father's stories and who, when the moment arrived, had the presence of mind to pick up the phone. None of that was something I had planned or sought or engineered. It had simply been true, operating at a distance I couldn't see, and it had arrived when it arrived, in a room I hadn't known it would arrive in, through a door I hadn't known was open. She did not break a rule. She honored a higher one, the kind that was never written down, because the people who wrote the manual assumed no one would ever have to choose between them.